Funding for this program has been provided by this station and more than 260 other public television stations nationwide, and by grants from Exxon Corporation and AT&T and the Bell System companies.
Oigan bien, señores. No aparecerán más asesinados en las orillas de las carreteras. Se irá a fusilar a quien esté en contra de la ley.
Turmoil in Central America. First there was Nicaragua, then El Salvador, now comes Guatemala. Good evening. A UN debate was dramatically interrupted Friday afternoon with the emergency announcement that 5,000 Indians in a Guatemalan village were about to be murdered by government troops. There have been no reports that the massacre did in fact come off, if it was even planned. But the incident served to further spotlight Guatemala, another Central American nation embroiled in a situation tragically familiar. Leftist guerrillas fighting a rightist-oriented army for control of the country, with innocent civilians caught in the middle, with U.S. officials in Congress caught up in a debate over what U.S. policy should be. Since 1977 and a critical human rights report from the Carter administration, Guatemala has refused aid from the United States. The Reagan administration wants to change that. Since March, there has been a new government headed by General Ríos Montt, an evangelical Christian. He took power in a coup engineered by the Army's younger officers. The older, more right-wing officers say he's soft on the leftists and communists. The leftists and human rights organizations claim repression and murder continue under Ríos Montt. It's a story that has received little attention thus far here in the United States, but that may soon change. Tonight, with a special film report, we take our first look at Guatemala. Robert MacNeil is off. Charlene Hunter-Gault is in New York. Charlene?
Jim Ríos Montt now holds an office he had long sought, but felt he had been cheated out of. In 1974, he ran for president and claimed victory, but the government declared a different winner and pushed Ríos Montt aside. In 1978, his party was totally excluded from running anyone for president against 3 Army officers. Himself a former chief of staff of the Guatemalan Army, General Ríos Montt was working at a Christian evangelical school when he heard of the March coup and was invited to the government palace to lead it. Ríos Montt is a devout Christian who closely identified with his faith, as Gavin Hewitt of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Journal explains in this report from Guatemala.
No podías, pero después de ahorita, de esta oración, vas a poder, jovencito, recibe ahora mismo en el nombre poderoso.
Through the bloody agonies of Central America, a flowering of Christianity.
Recíbelo, mi amiga, ahora mismo. Oh, Jesus, en el nombre poderoso. Señor Jesucristo.
As Marxist guerrillas besiege military governments, people seek comfort in the certainties of the evangelical born-again movement. In Guatemala, the words of the preachers have become a political force. For nearly 30 years, Guatemala has been dominated by deeply conservative generals who occasionally vie with each other for the spoils of the presidency. In March of this year, young army officers staged a coup and brought to power General Efraín Ríos Montt, a retired army officer and born-again Christian. The coup makers behind the general were tired of the corruption that was losing them the war against the guerrillas. Guatemala is the largest and richest country in Central America, endowed with fertile lands and natural resources. 60% of its people are Indians, 80% of whom are illiterate and undernourished. A land blighted by conflict which has left 30,000 people dead. It's here in the country that has seen so much of the killing that Ríos Montt's government will be judged. In recent years, Guatemala has witnessed scores of massacres. Its army has been accused of waging terror against the Indian people in order to prevent them from joining the guerrillas. It's a record that has made Guatemala an international outcast. The present government says it's trying to introduce reforms and is seeking foreign, in particular American, approval. We found terrible devastation, village after village destroyed, with some of the houses still burning. The Guatemalan Indians are caught in a deadly trap. They suffer reprisals from both guerrillas and the army, but their overwhelming evidence is that it's the Guatemalan troops who are still responsible for most of the massacres. In Quiché, Alta Verapaz, and Chimaltenango provinces, Indians have been driven from their villages into secure zones controlled by the army. The land left behind is scorched, a free fire zone for the troops. We traveled through 3 provinces and saw whole valleys empty of humanity with crops abandoned. 35,000 Indians have fled into neighboring Mexico, 9,000 of whom have arrived since Ríos Montt came to power.
Por favor, señores de la subversión, tomen nota de lo siguiente. Solo el ejército de Guatemala debe tener las armas. Ustedes dejen las armas. Porque si no dejan las armas, nosotros les vamos a quitar las armas. Y oigan más, oigan bien, señores. No aparecerán más asesinados en las orillas de las carreteras. Se irá a fusilar a quien esté en contra de la ley.
A one-time American hippie, is the minister at the church where President Ríos Montt worships. It combines raw revivalism with up-tempo songs of salvation. 3 of the church elders now have senior posts in the palace, and de Goya gives the president spiritual advice.
Thou shalt not respect persons, neither shalt thou take a bribe, for a bribe doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the words of the righteous. That which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land which Jehovah thy God gives thee.
Why does he think he was put in power?
God saw that he was the man, and it's very interesting to see his past. He's a man who's had very high integrity all his life. And I think that God prepared him, and at the right time, he was able to take office. He just sees that this is a fact, and I guess probably the greatest confirmation is that's where he is, you know.
The highlands of El Quiché, the heart of the war between the army and the guerrillas. The army controls a triangle of 3 towns. Outside, the hills and passes belong to the guerrillas. In this country, an army of 20,000 stands little chance of defeating 5,000 guerrillas. Access to the town of Nibar can only be risked by helicopter. On the tracks beneath, Vietnamese-style bear pits, sharpened stakes to deter army patrols. For the Indians of Nibar, it's fiesta time. Ancient customs carefully preserved, but performed without joy. A sad and largely drunken celebration in a town surrounded by a war that threatens the survival of its culture. To these people, Ríos Montt has offered a new program entitled Bullets and Beans. We flew north to the village of Santa Delia to witness the government's program in action. On the way, more evidence of the war, the burnt frames of once bustling villages. The abandoned blades of an army helicopter shot down by the guerrillas. This village has formed its own defense committee, armed by the government. In exchange for resisting the guerrillas and working on government projects, food is provided, bullets and beans for the Indians. The entire village assembled for our visit, rooted to the ground, it appeared, out of fear and bewilderment. For by accepting the government's offer, they had unwittingly become the front line against the guerrillas. Clutching their ancient weapons, they seemed unaware of the great dangers involved. We encountered an example of the vulnerability of the new civil defense groups near Chimaltenango. A truck carrying soldiers and civil defense volunteers was ambushed. The guerrillas detonated a mine and opened fire, killing 16. It's becoming harder and harder to determine the truth of these incidents in Guatemala. This appears to have been the work of the guerrillas, and the people here are petrified that the army will take their revenge on them. In our experience, the Indians remain unpersuaded that the government of Ríos Montt will introduce meaningful reforms. Sacks of corn donated by Ríos Montt's church are unloaded for refugees who fled the fighting. It's a scene eagerly recorded by the church minister. For Ríos Montt is looking to the evangelical movement in North America for $10 million in aid. In the past, the government says there was no other mission than combat. Now we seek peace through development. Without denouncing these acts of Christian charity, Ríos Montt's critics argue that his government has developed no coherent program of reform. The national economy is close to bankruptcy, and the ranks of the ill and undernourished grow.
Uno de los problemas que tienen los indios es que los mismos guerrilleros los están matando. Ellos están quemando aldeas y asesinando a toda la gente, porque están con nosotros. Y ya se dieron cuenta que han sido engañados por los comunistas. Y entonces los guerrilleros lo que hacen es destruir las aldeas, pero nosotros no lo hacemos.
I know what is happening in the villages. The army and the righteous people are pushing the civil war because they are organizing the people to fight against the guerrillas. And then the civil war is happening in those places. And the violence is out of the control of the army. They know that. And they permit many things happens inside the villages.
Like massacres? Like massacres?
Like killings, yes.
Many Indians say that the army is still responsible for the massacres in the villages. How certain are you that the army isn't responsible for this?
La certeza de que yo soy Efraín Ríos.
Ríos Montt has had some success in curbing the killings in the cities, and his attempts to bring corrupt officials to justice have wide popular support. But real power resides with the army, and in particular the young officers who never leave his side, even on a factory visit. Few have political or administrative experience. They've suspended all political parties and in their isolation rely on each other, graduates of Guatemala's military school. It was as director of the school that Ríos Montt established his ties with the young officers. One of the reasons they made him president was that his reputation for integrity might persuade the United States to resume military aid. Ríos Montt's first loyalty, however, is to the army, but many of the officers are ill-educated, groomed in the soldiering of terror. Many have resisted and ignored his appeals for a more humanitarian approach to the Indians. If the president were to overrule them, he could well be overthrown.
Los oficiales jóvenes son oficiales de ideales y son sanos y son bastante prácticos. Ellos no tienen un entendimiento de la confusión politiquera.
But they do monitor the president's performance. During our interview, I inquired of Ríos Montt why he thought he was put in power. The president replied by pointing to a man at the back of the room. Ask him, he said. He organized the coup. The man in question was Captain Munoz of the Zabala Battalion. He is the power behind the throne. At no time did the president appear in public without Captain Munoz a few paces behind him. He it was who collected the 913 signatures of young officers that ensured the success of the coup. But he and Ríos Montt have their enemies, in particular from the extreme right. The neo-fascist right believes that Ríos Montt's gentle reforms are dangerously liberal. Its leaders are Mario Sandoval and Leonel Cisniega. Sandoval campaigned at the election with the promise that he would kill every communist. He is reputed to have a private army of 5,000 men. Since March, the right has plotted 3 coups. Leonel Cisniega, who was the coup organizer, is now on the run, having failed to win sufficient support in the army. No one doubts the right will try again to topple Ríos Montt.
It's not an easy thing that he is facing. It's a very difficult task because he's facing it in institutions of government, of army, of the police, of all sorts of things like this that have had a history of a very negative way of operating, with incredible corruption, problems with violence, a very poor record in human rights. But I see that there's been a great change and an increasing change.
I don't know any reforms in this moment in Guatemala. In the economic structure, it's nothing. In the political system, the Democratic Party is in exile or underground.
And what about in the villages?
And in the village, is terrible, the repression.
In the hills, the question of who sits in the presidential palace counts for little. Authority to the Indians comes in the guise of the army. Even with a politically strong president, that institution could only change slowly. The painful truth in Guatemala is that the army has for 30 years abided by the most simple of maxims, namely that if you sympathize with the subversives, you're a communist, and communists are killed. To the Indians, the soldiers of Ríos Montt are indistinguishable from the past. Ríos Montt is now seeking American economic and military assistance, for he argues that if he's overthrown, only the fascist or the communist would prevail. This is Gavin Hewitt in Guatemala.
Into the studio now for a flavor of the U.S. debate over what U.S. policy should be toward General Ríos Montt and his government. First, George Forial, a fellow in Caribbean Studies at Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies. He just finished a report on Guatemala and the northern flank of Central America. Should the United States support the Ríos Montt government?
Question really can't be addressed in a vacuum. I think what's really involved here is trying to reestablish some sort of a policy relationship between the United States and Guatemala, a relationship which really hasn't existed since 1977, since the Carter administration. In order to devise an effective policy, you need to begin to develop some incentives and disincentives, some degree of leverage. I think that's really what's implied in whether we should reconsider some sort of assistance to
Right now, we have no leverage.
We have absolutely no leverage. In fact, the record of between 1977 and 1982 is a clear indication of that. And in spite of the decision not to help, not to assist, not to be involved in the Guatemalan environment, the result was really rather minimal.
Well, now the Reagan administration has decided to change that. They want involvement on many levels. Do you think, is that a wise move on your part, do you think?
I think it's a wise move in the sense that what I just indicated, and that is it's a beginning, it's a first step. It should not be read, as far as I can tell, as a suggestion that either this administration wants or suggests to the American public in general that we are condoning, that we are sanctioning events that are occurring within Guatemala. Certainly the brutal nature of those events. But I think it's a first step in reestablishing that relationship within the context not only of Guatemala but of broader Central American policy.
Well, what is your reading in terms of what General Ríos Montt is doing in terms of human rights violations and whether or not the country is changing, the kinds of reform? What's your overall reading of his government and what he intends to do?
It's an imperfect government. It's a government which obviously has difficulty establishing, I think, its own identity. But the question really can only be answered Ríos Montt in comparison to what? And the only way I can answer that question is by saying in comparison to the last 7 or 8 years, or perhaps even previous Guatemalan governments. If we're gauging the Ríos Montt administration on the basis of some idealistic democratic model, which probably doesn't even exist in Vermont or New Hampshire, then obviously they don't pass the test. But this is real international politics, and I think what we're suggesting is, in terms of the test, is improvement on the basis of what occurred between, let's say, March of this year and the present. And there's no doubt in my mind that there's at least an indication of a change in terms of the dissatisfaction by the young military officers, in terms of at least bringing to the fore a new type of political leadership. It's obviously unsatisfactory at this point, and it has a long way to go.
All right, thank you. Charlene?
Fuel for the other side of the debate comes from human rights groups that have been very critical of the Ríos Montt government. One such group that has been monitoring the situation in Guatemala is the Washington Office on Latin America, whose special assistant on Guatemala is Dana Martin. Mr. Martin spent 3 years as a missionary in Guatemala and was last there this past August. Mr. Martin, has the human rights situation in Guatemala improved under Ríos Montt?
Following the coup, there was a lot of hope that Ríos Montt would be a reformist government. But I think that after an initial period of maybe 1 month where there was a brief hiatus in the violence, reports started coming back in that there was still violence continuing in the countryside. And those reports have increased in recent months, and they seem to reflect a policy on the part of the government and the army, which would be likened to that in Vietnam. And it would be a scorched earth policy where they are going into the most remote villages, not the main townships, but into the really remote areas, trying to cut off the social base for the guerrilla forces. What's happening in that policy is that thousands of civilians are being killed. We have received a number of reports. 2 of the most recent ones were the massacre of the San Francisco finca outside of Nenton in the Huehuetenango province, in which 300 people were killed between the 16th and the 19th of July. There were 2 survivors to that massacre who fled to Mexico, and we have received their eyewitness accounts of that. The more recent situation was mentioned at the beginning of this program, and that is in San Martin Jilotepeque, where it was reported that 5,000 Indians have been surrounded by government troops, and that 300 of those have been killed. I received a report just this afternoon that 2 eyewitnesses have made it out of the area and have in fact confirmed that out of the 5,000 people, 300 were selectively picked out and killed by the government.
And it's your report that most of the killings are being done by the government as opposed to the guerrillas?
Yes, when I was there in August for 10 days, I traveled throughout the country and interviewed 40 people representing development programs and church groups in the country. And one of the main questions I asked as background for the remaining questions was who is carrying out the violence in the countrysides and how they know. And across the board, people said that they were convinced that it was the Army, in fact, who was carrying out the killings. The way they knew that was because of the use of tanks, trucks, and helicopters, which the subversive forces do not have access to.
Well, Mr. Martin, do you think the U.S. government should support the Montt regime and in the context of the leverage that Mr. Foriel just described?
I don't believe so. I think for the United States to support the Ríos Montt regime only adds credibility to his regime. It adds legitimacy to it, when in fact it is not a legitimate government that is supported by the majority of the people of Guatemala.
All right, thank you. Jim?
Gentlemen, first of all, we have a report late this afternoon from the State Department which says they have no evidence to support this, that 300 people were killed in this 5,000 thing. Do you know anything about that, Mr. Foriel?
Not about that particular event, but I think there's a pretty good record of uncertainty about these reported events. I think there's a temptation by the public at large and those that have a particular interest in these issues to assume that somehow don't want to sound cynical, but the civil war is waged with angels on one side and vicious people on the other. I think there's no doubt in my mind, I think it's a general picture that's being painted by everyone that doesn't try to hide the fact that there are extremely brutal situations to be found in the Guatemalan environment. And I don't think that this administration, currently in power in Washington, is at all trying to suggest that it is sanctioning those times of situation.
Mr. Martin, what about the point that Mr. Forio made at the beginning a few moments ago, which is if the United States is going to influence events down there, then it must have leverage, and the only way to have leverage is to use aid to do it.
I think that we can look both at the short-term situation and the long-term situation, and I think that there is so much opposition to the Ríos Montt government within Guatemala, within the masses of Indian people, that in the long run, that if the United States does support the Ríos Montt government, they are going to be set that much further behind in any influence they will have in that situation. I think the Civil War will continue, and the U.S. only loses the influence they might have in that region by continuing to support that government.
In a word, gentlemen, do you agree with General Ríos Montt's point that with that, if he goes, then you're either going to have a fascist government or a Marxist government in Guatemala?
I wouldn't exactly paint it in those stark terms, but there is some accuracy in assuming that there are people to the right of General Montt, and there's certainly a lot of people to the left of General Montt.
Mr. Martin?
I think that there is, I wouldn't put it in those stark terms either. I think there are also possibilities where a new government would probably be, have a socialist slant, but not necessarily Marxist in the Cuban Soviet mold.
All right, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Thank you both very much. Good night, Charlene.
Good night, Jim.
And we'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
For a transcript, send $2 to the MacNeil Lehrer Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10101. The MacNeil Lehrer Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content.
Funding for this program has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by grants from Exxon Corporation and AT&T and the Bell System Company.